On February 2nd, I put out the solo episode that was part 1 of this series, which I'm calling So You Want to Write a Novel. If in that episode I didn't anger you or totally discourage you about novel writing, I'm going solo again to continue my take on this subject. Today, I'll talk about preparing yourself, your work environment, and your story. I hope you'll listen. In the first episode in this series, I said a lot of things being truthful about the novel writing process. Mainly, I wanted to make the point that if you don't read a lot of novels, starting to write a novel is probably not the best way to start writing a novel. That sounds circular. Yes, I understand. I'm really worried about that sentence. I suggested writing a memoir or a short story, for instance, maybe even to get started, or even creative short nonfiction, especially if you are sharing stories about your own experiences and family that you believe will help other people. I know for a lot of folks who want to write more devotional literature that ties into spiritual concepts or scriptural concepts, that is maybe what you want to do. Again, being careful about how much you write about family members and friends without their permission or knowledge. I'm not going to jump into a discussion today of plot structure, character development, and world building, at least not yet. I want to start with preparing yourself. You need to read a few good books on writing, but not all at once and not necessarily the ones people tell you to, even ones I might mention. Therein lies the problem. If you haven't read a lot of fiction, these books can be misleading. So I will start by saying, start with the novels you like. You might learn more from a serious, slow reading of those than from most of the novel writing books. And let me tell you, there are a lot of those novel writing books out there. Just do a short Amazon search and you will find many, many of them. I've been told I should write one, but I don't know that I would get much traction on that. So instead, I'll do podcasts. Even so, I don't say read more novels so you can copy them, but so you can find what about them works and how the writer does his or her work. I read a lot of fiction by people trying to write fiction, and I can sometimes tell that an emergent novelist is deeply influenced by another writer. I won't get particular here, but and that may be necessary, but what made that more well-known author who they are is their own voice. The voice of Toni Morrison is very different from that of Cormac McCarthy. Not that any of us are at that level or probably will be. I probably shouldn't bring up the great names, the people with all the awards, but just to make a point, they are well known. I could do just the same with the mid-level authors like James Patterson or that kind of thing, although he's very much bestseller. He has an interesting story because he'll put his name on a book that's really written by somebody else to help them get traction and publicity, and then he makes a cut off of it, even though he didn't really write it. I don't know about that, but anyway, you are on a journey to find your voice, which I can define by referring to textbooks and websites, or I can just call it, and this is my version, the uniqueness of the writer's expression. And it comes from word choice and sentence structure. Those things usually are called style, but also tone, themes, settings, and point of view usage. It's more than just that William Faulkner has long sentences and Hemingway has short ones. It's more than just what's on the surface. Is the text essentially one of hope, or one of perplexity. Notice I didn't say despair as the opposite of hope, although there is some fiction that does seem to get trapped in despair of one kind or another. And that's another discussion for another day. And if it's not just first-person point of view versus third-person point of view, but how that point of view is used. Is it used to distance the writer from the reader? To even deceive the reader with an unreliable narrator? Or to allow a larger experience of the setting and plot for the reader? So let's step back on those 2 points. The point of view and the tone. It's very common for novelists today to use first person. From the very beginning, the reader knows it. I and me are probably in the first sentence. Maybe our and us and we. And the tone will be clear. And the outlook and mood of the narrator, who, remember, is not the author, but a character in the story telling the story. That story might be his or her story, or it might be someone else's. And I'll give a couple again of more famous examples, but there have been movies made about this, so you might be more familiar with them. In the book I consider the third most important American novel, All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, the narrator, Jack Burton, is not the main character, supposedly. That is the politician Willie Stark. But Jack Burton changes the most through his interaction with Willie Stark and others. There is a similar connection in The Great Gatsby between the supposed main character, Jay Gatsby, and the narrator character, Nick Carraway. Sorry, I don't want to make this a literature class, but there's a point here. Even if you don't want to write those kinds of books, you have to know some of those kinds of books, and I'm using air quotes, to write a good novel. If for no other reason, then they're going to be used as examples by people who write about fiction. Now, if you prefer Jane Eyre or Jane Austen, from 200 years ago, you might be female, and there's probably a reason. Those books end happy. And the 2 I mentioned above, All the King's Men and Great Gatsby, don't. They both end, well, I won't give any spoilers. They have darker themes, Gatsby and All the King's Men. Politics, greed, corruption, and what the so-called American ethos or culture does to one's self and identity. At the same time, for me to compare them on the basis of, quote, happy ending, end quote, is very superficial. Jane Eyre gets her Mr. Rochester, but can she really be happy with a man who deceived her so badly and cruelly? Who is living with the consequences of his marriage and what he had done? And Jane Austen is a different kettle of fish, you might say. Her novels are, in many ways, comedies of manners. They're satires about social class and convention, even parodies about novel writing, such as Northanger Abbey, as well as fun love stories that we like to see movies about. But they're more than that. Her last novel is probably the closest to our modern ideas. It is Persuasion, and it is, frankly, my favorite for a number of reasons, because it has all the good Jane Austen wit and such. But the heroine is older, she's wiser, and she's more realistic. She doesn't end up married to wealth and for the purpose of wealth. And the characters are more complex and human. I recommend it. Even watch a good version of it. The one with Amanda Root is very good. So back to point of view and tone. Let me read the two beginnings of novels, or the beginnings of 2 novels. The first one, I think you'll figure out quickly. And this is the first 3 paragraphs. Quote, "When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When it healed and Jem's fears of never being able to play football were assuaged, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. His left arm was somewhat shorter than his right. When he stood or walked, the back of his hand was at right angles to his body, his thumb parallel to his thigh. He couldn't have cared less so long as he could pass and punt. When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading to his accident. I maintained that the Yules started it all, but Jem, who was 4 years my senior, said it started long before that. He said it began the summer Dill came to us, when Dill first gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. I said if he wanted to make a broad view of the thing, it really began with Andrew Jackson. If General Jackson hadn't run the creeks up the creek, Simon Finch would never have paddled up the Alabama, and where would we be if he hadn't? We were far too old to settle an argument with a fist fight, so we consulted Atticus. Our father said we were both right. Quotation marks. Now, I should have read that in the deep Alabama accent, but you will recognize this as the beginning of To Kill a Mockingbird, one of the top 5 novels in American literature. It's obviously first person with I, our, we, etc. But that's not the totality of the voice. Harper Lee does not use the words of a 6-year-old girl who was, scout and when it started. Apothecary and Assuaged and 4 years my senior are beyond even smart 6-year-olds. But then she brings up a fist fight, which goes along with Scout's character. She seems to switch between the vocabulary of a 30-year-old and a little kid. But I think the key line is, when enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discuss the events leading to his accident. Here, she shows her hand. She's not remembering the events directly, but she's remembering her memories. Memory isn't straight. It is reinforced and affected by the memory process and the retelling of stories. Just like the fish gets bigger as the fisherman tells about it. Another thing about her opening is that there's self-deprecation and irony and some mocking in it. Even more as she gets into the story of their ancestor, Simon Finch, whom she says in a later paragraph was a very religious man who ignored, quote, his master's dictum about slavery, end quote. There are other famous books that begin with first-person narration. Call Me Ishmael from Moby Dick, which I have to confess I haven't read, but I have heard is on the top 5 as well. I will probably never read it, to be honest. Sorry. Just life's too short. I'll watch a good movie of it. Huckleberry Finn starts with, quote, you don't know about me without to have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter, end quote. We know a lot immediately from this sentence. David Copperfield starts, whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born, as I have been informed and believe, on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. These set the whole feel for the book from the very beginning, the mood, the hopefulness, perplexity, the dichotomy, the motivational sense of the character. Huck Finn wants to tell a story, an adventure story. David Copperfield shows something of a moral purpose, even if, as we read it, we think it's a bit much. I'll get off this detour, which really isn't a detour. Even if you prefer to stay away from anything written before 1950 or even later, you need to read novels before you start to read books on novel writing. As to those, be selective. Don't waste your money. You can find many of them in the libraries, public libraries. That's your best friend. You can find a lot of what you need on the internet as well. I am reluctant to make recommendations. A lot of people say to read Annie Lamott's Bird by Bird. And while she has a funny voice, by the time I read it in late 2024, I didn't need her advice, and it seemed old hat to me. I didn't really get anything out of it, but that's me. I had already written 10 novels and had studied the art. So for someone who's totally new to it, yes. she's a good start. Also, she grew up the daughter of a writer and must have been so that's she's going to have a very different viewpoint in that regard. Say that Kat writes a novel, oversells itself, but it can be helpful. Just know that her take on the novels she uses as examples, to me, is sometimes questionable. She makes them fit her plot pattern, but at the same time, it's a pretty useful plot pattern in general. And a lot of people get their ideas from the Joseph Campbell methodology or methodology, maybe we'll call it. Plus, the reason behind the title of Save the Cat Writes a Novel makes no sense to me. It's about the idea that you should make sure that your character does something nice at the beginning of the book to be sort of likable and redeemable. And my feeling is leave the cat in the tree. It'll come down when the dog goes away. Cats are perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, let me tell you. One stayed in my basement for a week while we were miserably sick with the flu, and even my dog didn't know about it. It was down there. There are lots of other books, and I'm sure there are places on the internet that will tell you which ones are best. Anyway, folks, you are going to learn to write by writing, having smart people read it, suffering through the art, not by reading lots of books on novel writing. All this is about preparing yourself. In short, read novels intelligently, even if mostly what you read is James Patterson or David Baldacci. They're obviously good. They're very, they're published. They get lots of money. So they know what they're doing, and you can learn from them the art of novel writing probably as much as from Dickens. Now, I do want to throw in my little thing about David Baldacci. He's actually my cousin's cousin. He's not my cousin. He is the cousin on her mother's side of a second cousin that I'm cousins with on her father's side and my father's side. So he's not really my cousin. I hope to meet him someday, though. He might give me some good advice. All right, so we've talked about preparing yourself. Now I'm going to talk about preparing your environment. Here I'm going to be a big fat hypocrite. We all think of novelists as having interesting desks. I applaud that concept, but I don't have an interesting desk. I like to write in a comfortable chair or not. I write where the mood hits me. I can be upright, I can be reclined, I can be standing. I use a pen. I like a Pentel pen, but I use a laptop as well. I do think the pen is more direct from the brain. It's more organic. I think it meets emotions better. But the laptop is faster and easier to read. I have atrocious handwriting and literally have lost ideas because I cannot read my scrawl when I'm writing fast. I think it's reasonable to say that most people are productive writing earlier in the day or not. If you can get up at the wonderful hour of 5 a.m. and write before the rest of your household gets up, that's great. Whatever you need solitude and long periods of it. I know folks who can write 15 to 20 minutes every day and produce a novel. I can't. I need hours to get lost in my books. At my age and after 10 novels, I'm not likely to change that. Folks who write will say, are you a pantser or a planner? Meaning, do you have outlines or do you just write by the seat of your pants? It's cute, but it's a false dichotomy. There's got to be both. There's going to be both. With some spontaneity and being in the moment and being tapped into your subconscious and it's just flowing. And there's got to be some outlining for everyone. You need to do both. What you don't have to do is write your book in order. That's a huge myth. But for the beginner, you do need an organizational tool. Like the books on novel writing, there are plenty of people to take your money in this regard. There is software and there are Post-it notes methods. Lots of paper will do the same, but you need a system, filing system, etc. A novel is too much to not have an organizational system, especially if it's historical fiction where there needs to be a lot of good, solid historical research behind it. There are many things I've not begun to address here. That's for later podcasts. Just remember, the order in which you write is not the order in which the novel will be eventually read. Because you are going to rewrite and rewrite, nothing you put down at first is permanent. Nothing is permanent until you publish. Don't get stuck on anything you write. It can and probably should be, in many cases, be reconsidered or discarded. My first draft of a novel was over 150,000 words, and it was terrible. And I had good friends who told me it was. Thank goodness. The published version was about 100,000 and not too bad. Don't take yourself too seriously at this point, or ever. You are trying to tell a story, and that is important work. Storytelling, it is one of our human essentials. If you lose track of storytelling, you will then get into those gray areas of rhetoric and making an important point and self-aggrandizement that ruin story and what you are really trying to do. Be realistic about the sacrifice this will take. If you can pound out a chapter of 1,000 words in an afternoon, super. Multiply that time and energy commitment by about 100, and you'll have the idea, and that's the first draft, not the final one. But enjoy it, because it's your world. You are bringing out of nothing but your own soul. Hello, listeners. This is an addendum to the previous part of the podcast on novel writing. It may seem a little self-serving at first, but bear with me. On April 16th, I will be attending an event in Atlanta at the Collinwald Fine Arts Center. I have never been there before or heard of this event before December, so it's all new to me. I am going because my publisher, Vicki McIntyre of Colorful Crow Publishing, decided in late August to send my novel, Lying In, to be considered for the Townsend Prize. I also had never heard of that before, or the Atlanta Writers Club, or the Georgia Writers Museum, which sponsors the prize and has since the 1970s. Let me insert here that although I consider myself a serious novelist who sometimes writes literary fiction, I don't follow the crowd much. I don't know who the big names are, the avant-garde publishing houses, or all of the awards that are available. I have heard, for example, of the Pushcart, and that's about it. I'm learning, but for the last 20 or more years, I've simply been trying to write, help other writers, and get some people to just read my work, much less than trying to get any recognition or make any money at it. Oh yeah, and at the same time, I was getting a doctorate, working full-time as a college professor and administrator, and having an incredibly full and dramatic home and family life, which I don't need to get into here. To my utter surprise, Lying In was chosen as a top 10 finalist for the Townsend Prize out of 47, I think. And I finally looked up what that is and thought, oh, this is for real. The first winner was Alice Walker of The Colored Purple. Another winner was Terry Kay, and another was Catherine Stockett. Although I have to say, I did not think her book was in the same category as the others, but they did make a movie out of it. The Townsend Prize is awarded every 2 years to a Georgia writer of literary fiction. Okay, that is a deal. The more they contacted me, the more of a big deal I saw it was. They do a fabulous job on publicity. Personally, I kind of think it's a fluke, and I don't have any expectation of winning because the others are far more accomplished, and you can also read that as far more famous than I. At first, my name was always last on the list, which I took as I barely made the cut. Also, in one article, I was referred to as the dark horse, but we'll overlook that. But it's still cool. I say this to say that if those 8 judges decided the book was worthy of consideration for this prize, I finally figure maybe I know what I'm doing with this writing gig thing. So If you would like to see what else I've written, check out my website and Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or Colorful Crow Publishing as well. I'd like to send them some traffic. After lying in, I recommend Bringing Abundance Back. If you like those, then go to Sudden Future, Long Lost Justice, and then Back to the Beginning. Those books were more faith-based, but not in the typical sense you're thinking about. I would prefer you start with my later material than the earliest. I know what I'm doing more now. I think the books are probably better. The first books are a little shocking for people due to the subject matter. I write dark but hopeful fiction. No really happy endings, but hopeful ones. All of the books are on Kindle, which is many people's preference nowadays, despite its limitations as a reading medium, which we don't need to get into here. I confess that since then I have sent the book to 2 other awards. I can't say it has caused my sales to change much. I'm not sure what the secret sauce on that is. And finally, thanks for listening to this podcast. And tell your friends, it's a labor and an expense of love. I don't do reviews because, well, I couldn't figure it out. Haha, on Apple. Just kidding. I just haven't gotten around to it. I'll close now. Thanks for listening.